Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
Here we go, Josh.
We'll see if we can get through this without any insane, crazy problems, especially on your end. It's been a day, huh?
Yeah, it's been a day. But like you just said, it's almost over.
Well, yeah, that's true.
So that's
and
good.
and today we're going to talk about a movie that has so many technical things going on in it that they can't afford to have a bad day when they're dealing with space travel. So we're going to talk about Brad Pitt and James Gray's new film Ad Astra, which is, like you say all the time, what'd you say, 70% of movies are about fathers and sons? So this fits
90%.
90%. Okay. I was trying to give all those other narratives, a little bit more credit, but I guess this definitely falls right into that.
It's changing very rapidly, but that was something a director slash acting coach slash mentor said to me once in a class, that all 90% of all plays and movies, and that's 1990-ish that he said it. So we are coming out of that, but that still doesn't change the fact that the play he was talking about is a play with a lead character who's female, and I think I told you the story, and he couldn't figure out to pinpoint this play what it was, how he wanted to focus this play. So he called the playwright and he said, yes, it's about a female lead, but really it's about the father-son. And he was like, oh, 90%. So that's where that comes from.
Wow. It's crazy. So yeah, this is definitely a father-son story, but it's also one of those things where it is, the whole fate of the world and the solar system relies on this story, on the specific specific relationship between the father, played by Tommy Lee Jones, and the son, played by Brad Pitt. So Brad Pitt gets sent on a mission to find his father, and who has been sent out to the outer reaches of Neptune to find life outside of the solar system. And he's kind of gone a little funny in the head. So things start happening, and so bad things start happening. So they have to send Brad Pitt out there to neutralize the situation. So this is the initially, and maybe it's because I have just recently seen Apocalypse Now because it's the 40th anniversary, and I saw it in the theater and all that stuff, and I was like, good God. It was the voiceover that really kind of kicked it in. And throughout most of the movie, I was like, can they do this movie without voiceover? It would be an interesting, different cut of the movie. And I think it might be more like a Terrence Malick movie if they did it that way. But where it's more about, images and, plaintive looks, as opposed to just kind of like, here's what I'm going through, here's what I'm thinking type of a thing, which is what I kind of got out of the voiceover. How did you like the voiceover in this? And did you see the kind of similarities between that and some other movies?
First thing out of my mouth was, this is a modern day space version of Apocalypse Now. It was going to be the first thing out of my mouth. Yeah, I don't have a problem with narration. A lot of people think that that's kind of a cheat. And there's that great line from Adaptation where he says, and don't you dare use a narrator. That's cheating. I don't have a problem with that because it's a visual art form that sometimes needs to be explained what exactly is going on in somebody's mind. And nobody has a problem with a monologue or an aside or, speaking to the audience in plays. People accept that for what it is. Nobody thinks that's cheating. Everybody thinks that that's just a way of a character filling in the blanks for people. And I feel the same way with this. I have no problem with narration. I like the fact that we learn things about this character immediately that makes us not necessarily consider him an unreliable narrator, but he definitely is one of those characters who's presenting one way to society and everybody involved with meeting him. And then in his mind, he's thinking a whole nother way. I don't know how you do that without narration, because a character who is, and that whole opening sequence of him, I smile, I say hello, and they're all like, hey, F you, dude, and they're joking around with him and stuff and flipping him off and having a good time, is showing you that he has an interpersonal relationship with the people that he works with. He has some form of relationship outside of just professionalism, because nobody would be flipping you off or saying those things if you didn't have that kind of joking personal relationship, even though it's a professional situation. So how would a character who is acting one way on the outside but thinking another way on the inside relate that to the audience when you're watching a movie? Because if he's acting one way to the outside, there's nobody he can turn to and say, you know, I act completely different towards your face than I do in my mind. There's no way to do that.
Mm.
So, and then Brad Pitt's delivery, and he's got this rich, deep cadence to his voice that only he sounds the way that he sounds, obviously, because, you know, he's Brad Pitt and he's an individual, but he has a different way. I don't know. He's from the Midwest or something, I think.
He's from Missouri.
Missouri. Okay. I don't know if it's the way he's learned to develop his vowels and consonants, but he has a very distinct, almost complete reverse way of saying something than most people do. And his timing and his delivery is different than what most actors would choose to do. So to listen to him, I've got no problem with, because he immediately locks you into something. So for me, I liked it. I don't have a problem with narration. Did you have a problem with it?
No, I didn't have a problem with it. It was in kind of like an exercise wondering how the storytellers would have been able to get their story through him, and it would have been, it would have been a lot quieter of a movie, because we're following this character through multiple. I mean, once again, just like Apocalypse Now, you're going on a journey from, point A to point D or point F or whatever, and you're hitting all these other pieces along the way, and the only thing that's the constant is Brad Pitt's character. And so seeing, it's a good, he's a good leading man to follow, and you realize the legacy of his father fairly immediately from after the first scene. You don't kind of know as much about it until after the first scene, but just understanding how he has complete control over his body and his emotions from the very beginning. That first scene was really cool. You don't realize he's not technically like all the way in space until he starts falling on the. I mean, this isn't spoiling. It's the first scene of the movie, but he's out doing a spacewalk essentially. But it's really a spacewalk on a really, really tall tower. And once he starts falling, I was like, oh my gosh, this is impossible in space, because it should be zero gravity, and he's got a space suit and all that stuff on. But really, it's just a high altitude suit that has forced oxygen so that he can breathe at those higher altitudes. But once he starts falling, his lack of panic is unsettling. For me as a moviegoer, I was unsettled by his lack of panic and his sheer calmness in that situation. I didn't know if he'd like blacked out or what, but then you find out later on in the next scene, and it's like, oh well, no, at no time in any of your spacewalks or any of your situations has your heart rate gone above 80. So that's something that he's probably developed over time, and he's been able to use that to control his emotions around other people, especially when it comes to his dad, because it doesn't seem like there's any way that he could ever reach the pinnacle of the expectations of being the son of one of the most famous astronauts, one of the most famous scientists, and one of the most famous people probably on Earth at that time, someone who was sent to be the conduit between other worlds and other species and other life forms and us and humans. Like, that's a huge thing to be chosen for, that Tommy Lee Jones was chosen for, and he is now the son of that guy and has to live apart from him, but underneath all of that pressure, whether it's self-imposed or just from other people. So, and the fact that he decides to go into the same job as his dad, is telling. So, I think that whole, like, wrapping all that up into, just two scenes is really well done. And then the kind of like the Voight-Kampff, whatever you want to call it, his whole, like, it reminded me of Blade Runner, where it's kind of like you're checking in on what your mental state is, and he's learned how to game that, or at the very least, he knows what it wants his body to do, and he's replicating that. So it's kind of sociopathic. He's manipulating his emotions regardless of what he's really feeling for that test. or he's been able to dull down his emotions. You're kind of looking up and to the left, which means that you disagree.
Well, because I'm trying to remember the exact. No, I don't disagree. I hardly ever disagree with you about what your take on a movie is, because one, it's your take, and two, I'm just trying to get your understanding of where we're going, and actually we're going down the same path that I was thinking we would go down together. So that was partially, and I was trying to remember if sociopathic meant that you had no empathy towards other people, or that you could manipulate their emotions, or you can manipulate your emotions, or you don't have any emotions. See, I was trying to figure that out while you were talking, like, because he can't be sociopathic because of the last couple of scenes of the movie. He definitely has an emotional range.
It's sociopathic tendencies where he's manipulating his emotions to get a response from someone else or something else that is expecting emotions.
Or is he that calm, cool, and collected and knows that this test is going to go this way if he stays calm, cool, and collected? It's like this. When we first started doing the podcast, I don't know if you were ever nervous in the beginning, but I always have nerve issues. Not nerve issues. I don't want to say nerve issues because I don't want them to become nerve issues, but I do get a little nervous. I don't, after 5.5 years, get nervous anymore because I know what we're expecting or what is to be expected. So I get excited that I get to talk about a movie, and I get excited to hear what your take on a movie is. And then I'm perplexed, and it's interesting to hear what somebody else's views are. And that's why I don't really read reviews until after we do the podcast. Sometimes I do to try to get a take on it. But the point to that is that I don't really get nervous. I know what to expect when we press record. And so, plus I also try to prepare, and I also understand who you are and how you respond and how I respond. So I don't really get nervous. So it's not that I'm manipulating my feelings. It's just that my feelings are settled towards this situation. So I didn't think he was necessarily manipulating his feelings. I thought it was an indication that he might not have those feelings at all. Like he just doesn't think that way. His body doesn't function that way. And back to the thing about when he was falling, it seemed to be he was more nervous for other people than he was for himself. When you see the shots of all the other people in the tower and stuff like that, although he doesn't overreact or underreact to them falling when they start falling. So I don't know. It's interesting because I think those kind of questions, that thing that you just posed about, is he showing, tendencies of sociopathic, is something that maybe we can learn 4 or 5 times after watching this movie that many times. Like what exactly, I don't know if you get that the first time.
Well, no, but I do think that what you're bringing up is actually a better point, because it may not be sociopathic tendencies. It's probably just something that's like just repressed feelings for his dad. Because I mean, like, his dad just like scooted off to something that was really, really important. And as a kid, he could have felt, I'm sure he felt pride for what his dad was doing, but he also felt possibly abandoned. And so we'll get farther into the movie and talk about that maybe a little bit more specifically. But those two things have probably been, wrestling in his head for a while. And I'm sure as he grew up, he probably, pushed down the abandonment issues and, amplified the aspirational issues and his reverence for his dad. And it got him to the point where he's today, or at the beginning of the movie.
Let me just interject this really quick and we can move on. I don't know if that's necessarily true, because what if he just doesn't have abandonment issues, and that he just aspired because he understands what his dad did, and he knows exactly, he says something about, you instilled that in me. So that connotates that that connotates that there was something, a lesson given that a child received, and it becomes something later on in this film. So maybe he doesn't have these issues, and he just has this resolve, the same genetic resolve that his father has, that allows his father to just up and go, yep, going to Neptune. Never been there before. Farthest reach of the universe that we've been to so far, but I'm going. I'll never probably see you again later. So maybe there's just something. I mean, you see that in a lot of characters in movies where their professional goal is more important than anything in their personal. And a lot of times people get attached to personal relationships because they feel like they have to. But if they didn't have to, by some kind of societal pressure, to be married or to have kids or to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever it may be. Maybe they would just go through life and be like, nope, not doing it. You know, Asperger's has a lot to do with, they don't have, that condition has a lot to do with not being able to connect physically with people, but there's not necessarily a need to either. So because we come from a society where we need to interact with people physically and socially, we think that that is not necessarily the right way to be. But somebody with Asperger's doesn't see it that way. They're like, I'm going to go be a doctor and cure cancer later, you know, like,
Yeah.
okay, that's cool that you're doing that later.
Okay, well, so especially since after this movie kind of got going, and once they put him on his course to Neptune, it really had a lot of like Apocalypse Now vibes for me, because he gets to the moon, he kind of like meets a liaison before he kind of gets off on his trip, and they explain all the situation. There's kind of like two kind of separate missions that he wasn't sure about until he gets more information from Donald Sutherland, who he is a buddy of his dad's. And so, all that kind of is kind of right along the line. And then especially once he keeps moving through the I guess, to finish up the Apocalypse Now similarities, he's essentially like on a ship with another crew that he's tacking on to, and the crew's already kind of like a self-contained unit. And, just right down the line, even the like Santapan off the port bow, that whole scene, I don't know, it's very in the front of my memory, where even though they're on a special mission with Martin Sheen in the boat, they go and they like check out this other boat over there, and they want to see what's in this other boat because that's what they're required to do. And he's like, no, don't worry about that. We've got this other higher level mission. The same exact thing happens in this movie. And so you're like, well, I wonder what's going to happen. So yeah, it's very, in some ways it's formulaic, but at the same time, it was a little bit kind of like comforting, I guess, because you're like, yes, this is something, what the next step is going to be, but you hope that you can get a little bit more out of it, or that the filmmakers do more from it. But before we kind of move way into that, I definitely wanted to talk about the moon scenes and the amazing sound design in this movie. That is the number one thing that I took from this movie technically, was it is the best sound designed space movie I've ever seen before. But Gravity is like really close. Like Gravity is so close, but this movie has more complexity to it than Gravity does, specifically because of the moon buggy sequence. And you see a little bit of it in the trailer, but there's stuff that happens when they're kind of like taking a moon buggy taxi from one moon base to another moon base. And so that, all of that stuff, the key to the sound design in that is that the only time you hear anything is when the character who is attached to something and that thing is attached to the ground. If the character is attached to the moon buggy and the moon buggy is attached to the ground, you hear the sound of the moon buggy, going through the ground. If things are happening away from you, and you can see them, you will not necessarily hear them. In fact, you probably won't hear them until they interact with you physically, until they touch you or something around you that you're touching. So it's kind of the opposite of like underwater. And when you're underwater, you hear everything, and it's hard to tell how far away it is and all that stuff. In this case, you only hear the things that physically interact with you. And it's so well done. I can't even remember if there's music. Do you remember if there's music in that scene? I don't think there is. Maybe there is.
No, I don't think there is either.
I don't think there is, but because that sound design was like so high in the mix, even that you're hearing all this stuff, and of course the whole time Brad Pitt is like steelily calm in the whole situation, which does still seem unnatural, but it is his character, especially at that moment. So I don't know. It was so well done, and throughout the movie, I kept on like waiting for there to be a gotcha. There was one gotcha at the very end, but sound design wise, I didn't find anything. There was a visual thing at the end, but sound design wise, it was perfect. It's the most perfect sound designed space movie. I mean, even with like First Man and all that stuff, like they didn't. It seemed like they didn't spend as much attention to detail in the dynamic scenes as this movie did. I mean, if this movie doesn't win sound design, I don't know. They need to hang it up, because they really should give it up. Yeah.
Call it out now. Put it into the universe. Well, let me just say this. I usually don't notice these things, and when you point them out, I go, "Oh, yeah, I didn't notice that." And then I watch it again and I say, "Oh, yeah, I hear that what Josh is talking about, or see that, and I understand that. I didn't hear that the first time." But I did notice that when they were getting shot during the moon buggy chase, which I love that we're calling it that, is that those laser beams, whatever they were, those blue, like, I don't know what you call them, laser beams.
They're like laser pulses, yeah.
Pulses, yeah. Yeah, laser pulses. There you go. You did not hear the sound of it until it was right up on you.
Yep.
And then you heard the kind of like, you heard it catch up to itself. You heard the sound catch up. And I was like, oh, that's clever, because you probably wouldn't hear that in space because of you're in space. And so I thought that that was really clever. And I noticed that.
Yeah, you wouldn't hear it in space at all, because there's no oxygen, there's no substrate in space. It's all a vacuum. So there's no atmosphere, there's no air, and the only reason we hear is because somebody, somebody hits a baseball, and then that bat against the baseball moves pulses of air, and those pulses of air actually make it to your ears, and they shake hairs in your ears. That's the only reason that you hear that baseball being hit from, 300 feet away. There is no air to move.
That's crazy. And I did notice that thing where you were talking about, unless it connected to something physical or connected to a person, like I noticed that you couldn't hear the wheels, and you couldn't hear the buggy of the other people, and you couldn't hear it was not Mad Max Road Warrior.
Yeah.
It was legit what would happen on the moon if there was a moon buggy chase. And here's the main point of why I really like this movie. We'll get to the last fourth of the film later on. It starts to lose me a little bit. But the reason why I thought that this was clever was because up 3/4 of the movie, I would say 75% of the movie, is based on an idea of future time, but not your typical reinvent future. They took something that we know now and made it logical that it was 100 years in the future, or how many years it was in the future. It was logical that these moon buggies looked the way that they did. They just took them one step further and built these colonies on the moon, which we've talked about and which people have talked about in this time frame that we're living in now. But it was an extension of the future. It wasn't this reinvention of the future. So it all made sense to me. These things made sense. And so I was like, well, a chase across the moon might, when they started talking about pirates, I was like, okay, well, there's obviously going to be a chase. They're obviously going to, be threatened by these pirates. And I thought, how are they going to do this? Because it's going to become, we don't need another hero. It's going to be Mad Max. And what are we doing with Mad Max on the moon? This is not going to work for me. Then I realized you never see the pirates. Not really. You don't see anything that identifies them other than from kind of far away. And so it's very realistically based. And if you were having to go to the dark side of the moon, what would that be like in a moon buggy? And they recreate that. And so it's really smartly done. They never make you accept a reality that you don't already think could happen. There's just things that just seem like extensions of where we're at now. So I think that's smartly done. And they continue that through the rest of the film.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's probably the most action packed. It's funny because this film, maybe this is bad. So we haven't gotten into spoilers or anything yet, but I will say that like this film gradually decreases in action and increases in emotion. And you don't realize that's what it's going to be until after about like you're in the middle of like the third, action set piece. And then you're like, okay, this is because it was like really dynamic at the beginning, but fairly quick. And then this, the whole moon sequence is great. And I guess technically they're called lunar rovers. So if anybody's freaking out that we're calling them moon buggies, they're lunar rovers. But still, but so you have the lunar rover. I could
see that thought cross your mind when I was talking, by the way. I could see you rectifying that in your mind when I was saying moon buggy for the third time. I was like, he's going to fix that
That's
fact.
Right. Oh yeah.
So there it is. I'm calling them moon buggies and they can kiss my ass if they don't like it. I mean that in the most positive way.
Yeah, no, they're good. But so then, yeah, the third set piece, which I think is somewhat spoiler-y, is less. I mean, it's dynamic, but I think it's less dynamic. And so it's there's a transition in the film, and I don't know. I mean, I think that the thing that saves it is Brad Pitt, and it's Brad Pitt's ability to connect with the audience. And I think that the voiceover helps that. I think that it does. It helps to ground the audience in his emotion.
I just thought of something else when we're talking about the voiceover. It would be a hindrance to the film if the rest of the film wasn't so silent for such a long period of time. The narration would hinder the film if it was that loud and that active the whole entire movie.
Mm-hmm.
But since it becomes such a quiet film and there's so much quiet time in this film, that the narration actually kind of settles me a little bit. It helps me a little bit because, no sound or no interaction with a human being can be unsettling watching a character go through that.
Mm-hmm.
So without the voiceovers and without him talking to the computer for his psychological test or updates, or even when he records the message to his father, without those, the silence would be deafening and would not help the movie. So actually the narration pulls you out of that a little bit. And I think that's good because it would be almost daunting to be that silent for that long of a period of time. If you're going with the same narrative that they're going with now, it would be too much. It would be oppressive and not helpful to telling the story.
Yeah, I think that we should probably start talking about spoilers, because I think once we start getting into especially the back half of the film, there's things that I think I wouldn't want anybody to spoil for me. If I haven't seen the movie, but I think that I think that the technical prowess shown by James Gray and by his technical team is it's very high, and it's a great space movie. When I compare it to, Gravity, Gravity in some ways is it's an emotional film, but it's also kind of like a gimmick film, and it is more centrally. I think this film has higher aspirations. I don't know if it reaches them, socially, but I think that it does have higher aspirations. And a movie like, I think this movie wants to be as serious as Interstellar, and I know a lot of people don't like Interstellar for some reason, but it wants to be as serious as Interstellar, and Paul is one of them. But I'm wondering. I don't know if there's as much meat on the bones of this film as it thinks there is. So that's kind of like my thing. And then the last thing I'll say is Brad Pitt. It's a great performance. I mean, he's had 2 amazing performances this year, and the first one was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where he does like the least that you've seen him do in a lot of films. But I think that performance is like he recognizes himself as an actor, and Quentin Tarantino and him play upon that much in the same way they do with Leonardo DiCaprio in that film. But it's also so well done, and it's one of those that's one of those roles that you can't see anybody else in that role. Whereas this film, I could see other people in this role, and I could see them not doing as well as Brad Pitt.
Agreed. Agreed. He has such a different way of delivering a line than most people. I talk about Legends of the Fall, right? That's the name of the movie.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. Can I skip it?
Okay. I never say stuff like that because I don't know what, like you and your wife could sit down and fall in love with this movie together. Who knows?
She's seen it.
Of course she has.
Yeah, I think
of course she has. Yeah, and I bet you if you owned it, she would watch it repetitively, which is a fantastic habit, in my opinion. I love that she does that.
She watches River Runs Through It a lot. Another Brad Pitt movie. And Fly Fishing.
Right.
So, yeah.
But that's also a prime example. Go back and watch that movie again and watch the way and listen to the way that Brad Pitt delivers his lines. It's almost like the polar opposite. There's a scene, very famous scene in Legends of the Fall, where he is talking to one of his brothers, I think, and he's drinking a cup of water. And most actors would use that cup of water because he has to dump it out and make this really large gesture with it. And I don't know if I can really explain it to you without having seen it. But when he does it, he says the line, and most actors would be throwing the water on the line. Brad Pitt says the line and waits like 3 or 4 seconds, then tosses the water, but he does it in such a way that's just completely different than the rhythm of what most people would do. And any other actor would probably be considered a bad actor for that choice. But for whatever reason, his opposite choices that he makes totally work. And he has a way of stringing them together and creating something that's unique to only what he can do. I think that's his power. I don't know if he will probably eventually be able to be an actor who just completely dissolves into a part. And that has to do with more about him being famous and good looking than it does about his ability. I mean, because in Benjamin Buttons, there's no doubt he's that little old guy. I mean, and he's little and he's old. And the thing in his voice and that whole Katharine Hepburn thing almost that he does, I hope that didn't just ruin that movie for me. But he just has a way of doing stuff that I admire because only he does it that way. And I would love to have seen him in his younger auditions when you had 200 people auditioning for one role, and then he walked in and did what he did in, what's the movie where he's the stoner and he smokes pot?
True Romance.
True Romance. Yeah, and he's smoking pot out of the honey.
He's Floyd.
Thing. Right. Yes. That's a prime example. Can you imagine that audition process and seeing like 15, 20 people, and then Brad Pitt walks in the room and does that? Even the way he does that speech in Thelma and Louise that made him famous is just different than what most people do. So I'm never really sure if people think he's a great actor, but because I'm all about great choices, he's phenomenal. And he is phenomenal in this movie.
There we go. We're done with the Brad Pitt love fest.
Okay. Well, there's never going to be enough of love fest for Brad, but right now we got to move on.
Yeah. So we're going to be going into some spoilers for the rest of this movie. So you have been warned. I think that once he gets on the mission and we start to see his interaction with the other crew, it really slows down actually. And I also feel bad for some of the it seems like since this is such a him movie, a movie like centered around his character, there's no room for any other characters. And I feel like Ruth Negga she suffers from that. And I feel like the crew suffers from that. There's no time to get to know anybody. And it's a fairly long movie, isn't it? And so
2 hours and 3 minutes is not that long.
Okay. Well, so it's not the longest movie out right now, but yeah, so 2 hours. I mean, it could easily have been like 2 hours and 30 minutes, but I can see why they have that cut. But it just seemed like it was, and it didn't even seem like it was barreling forward. It just seemed like it was kind of like taking characters and just throwing them away, especially with the Ruth Negga character, because she has somewhat of a backstory, with her parents, leaving to go with Tommy Lee Jones. Kind of like, I think that religion there's an undercurrent of critique of religion throughout this film. You don't see that?
No. I just don't say. I was shaking my head no to it being an undercurrent. It's not an undercurrent.
It's an overcurrent.
It's on the surface.
Okay, good.
No, it's in the surface. It's overground in this one.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's an indictment or if it's a statement about religion. Once again, I'll go back and I'll probably see this film again and I'll see it from that perspective. But to me, I thought it was jarring that it was there because I thought it was a bold choice. I don't understand the choice, though. I thought it was bold because you've got these, and they do make a statement about that somewhere in the film about how it's kind of contradictive to what we know because we can't prove the existence of God through scientific methods. So it's contradictive to what we do for a living or what we do as what possesses us to do in our life. So I didn't quite understand why it was even in there. Like, why was it there? It was, I don't understand the choice. It's not that I didn't like the choice. I just didn't understand it. Like, I thought if it was much more blatant of an indictment, I would have liked it more, or much more of an encouragement to believe in God or praise of God, then I would have liked it more.
Mm-hmm.
If it would have been, well, we've come so far as human beings, the only reason why we've come this far is because of God, then I would have understood the choice. And so I would have liked the choice more. I just don't understand why it's
Mm-hmm.
there. And it's a little subtle in the beginning. It's in there. Tommy Lee Jones says something and you go, wait, what did he just say? Did he just pray?
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what's happening here? Because he's not the, the most likely character to say anything about praising God, being a scientist and being an astronaut. But then I was thinking about it on the drive home and I thought to myself, well, you know what? There are a lot of characters who are in complete contradiction with what they say. They do one thing and then they act a certain way, another certain way in a movie. So this is the ultimate contradiction. So it does color it in a way that's interesting. I just don't understand
I
it.
don't think it is a contradiction though, because as you get farther and farther into science, especially theoretical science, it's less and less about the measurements and about the numbers and the grinding it out, and it's more and more about having faith in something that's more complex and bigger than you or the things that you can understand. Like things like with the Large Hadron Collider, there's things that we've like started to touch on, dark matter, all of those things have this kind of aura around them because we can't understand them. I mean, it's throughout time, scientists have butted up against things that they can't understand. Now, there's a lot of those things that we understand now, like something like lightning. It's like, what's that thing? How does that even work? What is going on? And now we essentially have the ability to harness lightning in our pockets. That's, electricity. There's things that we never knew we could do before. And we knew, but the scientists back then who didn't have it figured out knew that the people in the future were going to have it figured out. And so they had faith in not necessarily themselves and not necessarily God, quote unquote God, but faith in the process of discovery. And I think that's kind of that's what Tommy Lee Jones has his outlook for. He just feels like he's going to be the one because people have built him up. I mean, obviously got a huge ego throughout the whole film up until the very end. And even when he fails, I think he still has that huge ego to the point where, I mean, we've already said spoilers, to the point where he kills himself. He can't go back. He has failed in his mission. And he probably also believes that, like, if I couldn't find life outside of our solar system, there's no way anybody else could, let alone my son. In fact, it'd probably be worse for him if his son found it, whatever. But I mean, actually, he probably doesn't care about his son. Sounds like he doesn't care about his son, so never mind about that. But I think that, yeah, there's a couple of layers to it. I think that when you get to the moon, you've got the whatever subway on the moon and the cowboy gambling, whatever stuff on the moon. There's a feeling of capitalism. There's a feeling of, this is our moon. We take it, we own this portion of the moon. And it's like, nobody owned any of the moon before all this stuff started. And now certain people own this certain chunk of the moon. And an indictment of colonialism, of how the United States started. You can read a lot into all of that. And that can either come from a, look back, retrospective, let's move forward, understanding what our ancestors did, or you can look at that from a perspective of saying, like, let's just blow it all up and nobody owns anything and it's anarchy. I don't know. But so yeah, I think that it was sprinkled in from the very beginning, but like by the end and by the time Tommy Lee Jones and Brad Pitt start talking, it's pretty overt, and it's critical of, I'm not even going to say critical of God necessarily. It's just critical of how there's a feeling in there may be a feeling in someone's head that that there is something out there and there's no other option. And I think what this film is saying, that like, what if the option that there isn't a God is a reality? They're transcribing that onto other beings. But that's the other thing, is that I don't understand. It seems like that's the feeling they're trying to push on us. But by the end of the movie, we're not forced to say. I don't think anybody watching the movie is forced to say that there is no extraterrestrial beings. There are no, well, not even terrestrial. There are no beings outside of our solar system. There's just no beings outside of our solar system that we can sense. That's it. That's all that means. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means that we're not seeing it right now. There's always there's always a path for hope, and I think that's where I come down on that. I'm as far as atheist versus someone believing in God, or atheist versus agnostic versus someone believing in God. I think an atheist is someone who closes a door. I don't have anything against atheists specifically, but I think atheists may close a door that, whereas an agnostic would keep doors open or keep options open. I think that someone who, I'm not going to speak for everyone who believes in God, but like for me, I feel like that's a beneficial thing for me, but it's not something that I'm willing to say that there's no other options. So I'm a little bit more open to other options than just a hard and fast, this is how it is. And I would hope that other people who have the opposite view of myself would have that same view, at least to be able to talk about it constructively. So seeing something like this, it's kind of like the Tommy Lee Jones characters, like this is impossible. I've completely failed, and I don't, and there's no other options.
Well, I think you've tapped onto a couple of things, and let me try to clarify a few things from listening to what you're talking about. So you're saying that it's not necessarily an indictment about God or believing in God. It's about the fact that they don't find any evidence of other beings, so you should have doubt in believing in God, one. And two, that's sort of a problem with the last 25% of this film, is that you've done all of this hanging your coats in certain closets all the way along this film. You hang your coat on the moon, then you hang your coat on the mission, and then you hang your coat on what I think is the devastating part of this film that makes it not work for me, is when he has to, spoiler alert, we're in the territory.
Yeah.
So if anybody, I know, but I have a tendency to say things and then get blamed for them. And then I just want to make sure that everybody understands this is a big thing I'm getting ready to say. And I would not want to know this myself, but it does come to my point. When he accidentally purposefully kills all three members of that flight crew, if you will, that's when I went, there was no other way to do this. Narrative wise, there was no other way to do this. He knows that there was no other way than him having to sneak onto the mission or onto the spacecraft. There's no other way to do that. I didn't understand why they needed to flip that the way that they did. Why did they make it such a definitive choice that he had to make? He had to sneak onto it. Was it to give Ruth Nega's character more to do? Was it to make it an interesting underwater sequence? What was the reasoning behind him having to be taken off the mission and then have to sneak back on? And then once he made that choice, he knew that there was no way throughout all of his training that they were going to go with him. Hey guys, I'm here. I come in peace. Come on now. Him knowing, Brad Pitt's character knowing what he knows, if he was in the reverse and he was the captain of that mission and somebody snuck onto his mission, he wouldn't believe them either. He wouldn't be like, okay, yeah, let's hear what you got to say. Take him out. First of all, he sets off an alarm. He sets off a whole bunch of alarms. He endangers everybody's life immediately by doing what he did. A couple of seconds later, it could have been boom. The whole thing could have blown up. I guess maybe the filmmaker / screenwriter / director wanted to up the antes at that moment in the film, but it just seemed like it was not a logical choice. Okay. So I kind of digressed into that because I wanted to make that point before we got over with the podcast. And I was like, oh yeah, I wanted to mention that. Okay. So that's mentioned. So back to what we're talking about. So you're saying that with not believing or not being able to prove that there is other life, that the film is making a larger statement about not believing in God? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like saying, like, if we can't find any other beings or anything like that may just not even exist. So the search for proof of God may be fruitless. So you should recognize that there's a possibility that there is no God. Like, kind of trying to say people, like, okay, there has not been proof of God, therefore there is a possibility that there is no God.
Well, first of all, unfortunately, that's not an original theme. So we've seen that a million times in movies. Second of all, I think that's in complete contradiction to what people who believe in God think or feel, because it's about faith. It's about having faith in God, and it's about having faith in your belief. And then you learn the lessons of your life through the vision of believing in God. Okay. At least that's my take on it. Because I've seen people, and you are one of them, and your wife is one of them, that you walk in the light of the Lord. And I say that in all sincerity, and people might think that I'm making, a comical statement, but it's honestly the truth. And from one person who has more doubts than you do, meaning myself, I can see that when you put your foot forward in life, meaning you, Josh, you actually do it with the integrity of a believer of God. And things that you do are based on your faith, and you believe it and you live it, and you don't try to inhibit other people because of it. So just because you don't see an alien doesn't mean there isn't one.
Exactly.
Just because you don't see or can't prove that there's a God doesn't mean there isn't one. Yep. As for your, I was going to say agnostic, an atheist statement, what I find interesting about atheists, and this is not a condemning statement, it's a pondering question statement, is really, how do you know for sure?
Exactly.
Like, really, how do you know for sure?
Yeah.
And that can be reversed to somebody like you who believes in God. How do you know for sure? Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
An atheist can say the same thing that a person who of faith believes. It's what I feel. It's how I feel. But really, how do you know? So to cut yourself off one way or another is just not how I live my life. Now, people who are of extremes on both sides will point their finger at me and say, well, you're just playing both sides to be safe.
No.
I don't feel that way.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to have an understanding for myself how I feel, belief or not believing. That's for me. I find it interesting, though, that somebody who is of faith like you took that from this movie, because I didn't get that at all.
Well, I think I'm sensitive to someone who may be critical of their version of a Christian, or not even a Christian. We're in the United States. There's mostly Christians in the United States, so that's why I say that. But of a God, someone believing in God, I'm looking at it as someone of faith, looking at an industry which is primarily grouped together as people who are atheist, or usually at least agnostic, and making art that, every once in a while, plays upon God and faith, but a lot of times may have like an undercurrent of the opposite. And I think this one was trying to be a little bit more overt about it, but not completely coming out and like banging you over the top of the head. But I'm fairly sensitive to that, and I want to make sure that they're coming at it in a respectful way, of everyone on all sides of an argument, or all sides of a discussion. So, and I don't know if they did that.
Well, let me say this. I knew that's where you were coming from, but I didn't want to say that because I didn't want to sound like I was making an indictment about your opinion about something, because I was going to say, I think maybe you might be a little sensitive to it. But here's the thing. Even if the narrative of a movie is subliminally criticizing Christianity or the belief in God, that should in no way inhibit who you are as a person, because you are not part of that criticism. You are a believer in God. That doesn't necessarily mean that criticism being focused on a believer in God or a Christian, finger quotes, has anything to do with you. Because as a person, coming from my standpoint of a questioner, I don't know what my standpoint is. I have my doubts. It depends on the day of the week, I'm like, what? Look at that sunset. Of course there's a God. And then I'm like, yeah, there's no God.
It's a journey. It's always a journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And see, right there, that's a prime example of what I'm talking about. Instead of going, well, Paul, you need to, as you point your finger at me one way or another, believer or not believer, you take the right road. You say it's a journey. So you give me my space to follow what my journey is. Most people who might be indicted by this film point their finger at somebody and say, if you don't decide now, or how can you believe, or how can you not believe, when they point their finger at me, I go, I rented a car that's a free journey car, so I'm going to go my way. You go to Avis, you get your car, you go to wherever, you get your car. So I would love to be able to just say, here's the freedom to just be who you are, Josh, without worrying about that indictment about Christianity or God or Jesus or anything that a movie's trying to make has anything to do with you, because it doesn't. It never does. But what I find more fascinating is that, and I understand why you might take that a little personally. I get it. And the reputation that believers have can have people pointing their fingers at people because there's a reputation. You fall into none of that. But what I still find more interesting is that I can't wait to see this movie again for a couple of different reasons. But now I can't wait to say, what would it be like to be a believer like Josh and see this movie? So all of those things that were not ringing to me like they were ringing to you now will sound differently to me, because now I'm looking at it and hearing it from a different point of view. And if that's what this movie was about, then it's a great movie. I champion this movie now, but I don't think it actually hangs its coat in the right closet close to the end of the film, to get back to that little analogy or that metaphor.
I think the reason why they had to get rid of all those people going from Mars to Neptune was that you have to have the space and time for the one-on-one interactions between Tommy Lee Jones and Brad Pitt at the end.
Okay, so but then you're supposed to understand that he has a semi-happy ending at the end of the movie because of what Ruth Negga says about Tommy Lee Jones' character, in that they covered it all up and they changed the narrative of his story, that he killed my parents, but nobody knows that. Everybody thinks he's like this savior of mankind. No pun intended. Is that what we're supposed to believe happens to Brad Pitt's character at the end of the movie? Because he completely goes on to this mission he's not supposed to go. He kills 3 people. And then, he ends up doing what they wanted him to do, or what they wanted the mission to do. So does that mean all is absolved? I just think at some point when you make such large, bold choices, that you're going to have to turn to the audience, since you spoon fed them some things, and you're going to have to turn to them and say, okay, in my mind, I know this was murder. But to me, I know the bigger mission was to complete blowing up the ship in Neptune, nuking the ship at Neptune, because that would stop more people. So the larger picture was more important at the time. I know it's murder, but sometimes you have to make choices in life that, whatever, something. It just happens. And if they didn't do so much, well, it's not a lot, but if they didn't do so much explaining in the beginning of the film with the narration, then you wouldn't be missing it at the end. You would fill in the blanks yourself. But at the end of the film, I'm filling in blanks and I'm like, but they filled in so many blanks in the beginning of the film. Why am I now trying to struggle to figure it out?
So the scene at the end, or the few scenes at the end with Brad Pitt and Tommy Lee Jones, do you feel, we haven't seen Tommy Lee Jones in a while. He's an Academy Award winner, and he's been in some amazing movies. But what did you feel about his performance? Do you feel like it added to the film, or do you feel like it was just? I'm trying to they build up this character for the whole movie, and then we get this interaction between him and Brad Pitt. Was it an amazing turn by an amazing actor, or was it just kind of blah? I don't know what to feel for. I feel like he's the Colonel Kurtz, obviously, in this movie, and there was no menace, there was no hyperbolic anything to. I'm not trying to directly, compare him to Marlon Brando in Apocalypse
that's
Now,
a completely unfair comparison, but I understand what you're saying.
But what I'm saying
you
is
can't.
That,
come on.
Yeah, it's built up, and then how did it come across to you from an acting standpoint, and just from did it feel like it was satisfying as far as we've been waiting this whole time to see this interaction, and was it all you'd hoped it was going to be?
Okay, no. Because the final 25% of the film let me down. That I don't think has anything to do with Tommy Lee Jones. First of all, if he was different than the way that he was presented throughout the film and the clips that you saw him in the flashbacks or whatever, or the videos or whatever, then I would have been wanting more at the end. But he's sort of the same guy, even though he admits things to Brad Pitt that he's probably never admitted before. Do I think that they could have gone a little more like Lost in Space for a long period of time crazy? Yeah, they could have, but that's only because of what happens to Brad Pitt on the 79 days that it takes for him to get to Neptune from Mars. So if it wasn't for all of that playing out, then maybe what Tommy Lee Jones could have been, what they could have asked of Tommy Lee Jones is that he be a little bit more, I've been in space by myself for a long time crazy. I'm kind of glad they didn't go down that route because you got what you needed to get. And I will now say, Brad Pitt is 50 something years of age and he looks great, but he definitely looks like he's aging. And then you see Tommy Lee Jones and you think, wow, Brad Pitt is so young looking, like it's so drastic how much older Tommy Lee Jones is.
Yeah.
And I like that because it's not a statement about ageism. It's a statement about character development. So for me, to see his wear and tear on his face because of not only his age, but his experiences in this film was important. It was, this is what Brad Pitt would look like at the end of his life because of the struggles that he's had in his life. So Tommy Lee Jones needed to look run down. He needed to look worn out. He needed to look tired. You start to hear about Brad Pitt's not sleeping well, and that doesn't really affect him. He tells his little psychological test computer, but it obviously does affect him. And then I'm going to go back to what I said about Brad Pitt having a unique cadence. It never dawned on me. Tommy Lee Jones has that too. They are perfect father and son. They have this way of delivering a line that only they can do it. Only them. And then I thought, oh, well, Brad Pitt's not that unique because Tommy Lee Jones has this strange dialect that's, you can't really identify where he's from, but he has this strange clipping of his vowel sounds that he makes. And it's almost like Brad Pitt swallows his vowel sounds and Tommy Lee Jones overemphasizes his vowel sounds. It's a really unique sound to my ear. And I thought, oh, well, that proves the exception to the rule because I thought Brad Pitt was the only actor in Hollywood that sounded that way and gave line readings like that. But it's not. There's Tommy Lee Jones. And now I'm like, is Tommy Lee Jones really Brad Pitt's father? Like, is this a kept secret? Because my gosh, did they ever look like father and son? It is anticlimactic, but that's not Tommy Lee Jones's fault. And that's not Brad Pitt's fault. That's the screenwriter, director's fault, if you will. Not fault, just issue, because they're posing so many questions that they don't answer any of them at the end, which is fine. You can fill in the blanks yourself, but it strictly becomes a father-son 90%er at the end of the film. And I don't think that's as unique as this film seemed to be leading you up to something more unique. But are the endings of any of these movies ever satisfying? With the exception of
Gravity's pretty good.
Kubrick's. Gravity's pretty good. Yeah, Gravity's pretty good. And 2001 is great.
Yeah.
But these whole like mission to figure out somebody who got trapped in a black hole or whatever always end in these not nonsensical, but just there's no way to build up to it and then have it pay off. There just isn't. And we've seen it all before. I don't really love you. I don't really love your mother. I didn't really love you. I didn't really love your mother. This is what's important. So that posed, the first question was, then why did you have a son or why did you get married? But we know the answer to that question because we talked about it earlier. This is what society deems what you're supposed to do. That's why it's crazy, that kind of pressure on people. But then I love you anyway. We've seen it. Monsters Ball, Heath Ledger, Billy Bob Thornton. I mean, we've seen it. You name 1,000 different references to, I never loved you, boy. I loved you, Dad. We've seen it. So without the powerful performance of Brad Pitt at the end of this film, there would not need to be this movie. This movie would not need to exist. And it's because of their two performances at the end. I think I disagree with what you said about Tommy Lee Jones giving up because he wasn't able to find life outside of what he knows is life. I think he has come to the conclusion that he's just given up, just period, given up, because nothing he has done at this point. I don't necessarily think he's given up on the idea that there's life, or that he's perplexed by the fact that his son might be somebody, or maybe not capable of doing it, like you were saying earlier. That look of Tommy Lee Jones, like wanting to let go at the end of the film, had, I think he just had enough. It's like a marathon runner who has done, a triathlon, and they're coming to the last 5 feet of the finish line, and their body just collapses because they just physically can't go on. I think that can mentally and emotionally and spiritually happen to a person too. Yeah. I think he's given up. He's done. He just is done. And he has no purpose for going back. So why even? It's not necessarily a loss of faith. It's just there's nothing back on Earth, or there's nothing back on the moon or Mars or wherever they're going to end up. There's nothing that's going to satisfy him as a human being. So I'm done. I'm going to bed. I'm not waking up. I'm done. You've seen it a million times in movie. So I find that sadder, actually. I find that if somebody loses faith, that I can compute. If somebody says, oh, I didn't find life at the end of Neptune, but you won't either, I can compute that. I'm done with this journey because I'm done, that doesn't make sense to me. Because I'm always like, what's the next play? What's the next movie? What's the next conversation with Josh? What's the next lunch with my dad? What's the next concert I'm going to? I'm always like, what? I want to know what happens next. That doesn't make life any easier at all, but it definitely keeps me in the game. So what does it take to finally say, I'm done? And I think that's where Tommy Lee Jones is at the end of the film. He's just done. And there's no reason to come back. See, I always have a reason to come back. Yeah. Just the fact that, I don't want people talking about me because I'm no longer here differently than when I should have just been taken out. Like if I just died in a car accident, God forbid, if I take myself out, or if I decide I'm just done and just die, people will be like, what the hell is wrong with him? I don't want people talking behind my back. I want to know what they're saying to my face. And the only way to know that is to stay alive. So I think I made my point. I think he's just finished.
Yeah. We may have to agree to disagree on that one, but I do. Yeah, I see. I love
how you sounded like you were getting ready to agree with me. Yeah.
We're definitely gonna agree, but we're gonna disagree. Agree to disagree.
I love it. I love it.
So that this brings up the one of the couple of like little things that that bugged me a little bit. Right as he lets his dad go, you see him crying, in space, within his helmet, but in space, and they've shown this before. You can see it, and it's been reflected in movies properly. But in space, like when you cry, all of your tears, they ball up like around your eye, like they don't leave your eye. The surface tension of the liquid stays and makes little like balls, like little like droplets that stay connected to your face, and they'll just keep spreading out along your face. So when you sweat, it's the same thing. When you sweat, you have sweat all around your face, and it doesn't like float around, and it doesn't like drip down or anything like that. But you could see like tears, like, or at least 1 or 2 tears, like dripping down his face.
Even with the helmet, with oxygen and all that stuff in it?
Doesn't matter. It's zero gravity.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the only reason a tear why doesn't a tear go up? Because there's gravity. The tear goes down because it rolls down your face, just like a ball would roll down a hill.
Gotcha.
But there is no balls rolling down hills in space. The ball would just like float, and the hill would float. So much in the same way, your tears would float, except they're already connected to your body, so they just stay connected to your body the whole time. But it would have looked weird compared to what we're used to seeing. Like I wanted to bring up the earlier scene, the anechoic chamber scene, where he's making a recording for his dad for like laser transmission. It's like a two-way radio essentially to Neptune from Mars, and he's talking there's no reason to have him in an anechoic chamber, but whatever, it looks really cool. And it is. I've been in anechoic chambers and they're crazy. I was in one at Klipsch headquarters in Indianapolis where you're in this room. I don't even know if I've talked about this before, but they use it to test speakers, to test, like home theater speakers and stereo speakers. And you're in this room and there are no reflections. Everything is all of the sound is being absorbed in all the walls around you. So when I walked in the room, there's a guy all the way across the room from me. It was like a 20-foot by 20-foot room. It was a pretty big anechoic chamber. And he was, whatever, 20, 30 feet away from me, catty corner. And he was just speaking in normal voice, but it sounded like his mouth was right next to my ear, because it was freaky, because usually we can tell where somebody is based on their voice bouncing off of multiple walls, the ceiling, the floor, different walls. And our brain recognizes that where they're at by how the sound gets to us, at what point the sound, each of the reflections get to our ears, and which ear they get to, and all that stuff. So, but in an anechoic chamber, there is no reference. So it doesn't matter where he is and where I am. It sounds like he's just this. He sounds like he's right in my ear. So it's freaky stuff, and it's very silent. There's just like no sound in there, and it is a little disconcerting. It's kind of like I've never been in one, but like those like deprivation, sensory deprivation tanks that people get in, and they float in whatever the salt stuff and all that. It's something similar to that, but just with sound. So it's crazy. So he was in that, and then he had this emotional scene. I think it was close to a single shot. I don't know if the thing was a single shot, but I could tell that he did that like actor thing where you start in one place and you like end up like crying and being in this like serious emotional thing. And that's always the crazy part. But from hearing you talk last weekend, or from hearing you talk last week and on the podcast about this past time you're performing in a play, it sounds like that's something that you can just turn on. Or I mean, someone can just like, if you've done it enough, you've got your signposts, and emotionally where to be within a scene or within a monologue. No?
No. What's interesting is to see you technically try to understand it.
Yeah. How do I dissect this thing? Come on.
You don't. It's actually, I think the things that I've said were, if it's on the page,
Yeah.
then it happens. So it depends on how well written it is. I'm not a great judge of how well written something is. I just think that it doesn't feel that way to me. It doesn't feel like a technical thing. It just feels like something that happens, and it's like when you're watching a scary movie and you get that hair standing on the back of your neck, literally, or goosebumps. It's like that, but it's inside. Sounds really kind of cheesy, but it's inside your soul. I mean, that kind of goosebumpy, hair raising feeling is in your being, not just in your physical being. It's in your being. And I think you are fortunate, meaning you, second person, anybody is fortunate to be able to allow that to come out and to tap into it when you can. But to tap into it sounds like you can actually turn it on and off when you want, which you would think that's what it would be if you were doing something on stage. But for me, it's not. It's either going to happen or it's not. And luckily, because I'm fortunate, it does happen more often than not. But that happens to me in real life. I mean, I'll be watching something and I'll be tearing up and getting all emotional, and people are just eating their popcorn and drinking their sodas and looking at their phones and completely disconnected to it. So I think it's a gift. And I don't know what Brad Pitt's process is, but the only technical thing I've ever heard came from Anne Hathaway talking about Bryan Cranston's advice about crying on film. He said, the only advice I give to somebody is make sure you're hydrated. Make sure you drink a lot of water before you start filming that scene, because you have to do it over and over again. The ability to cry is, I think, just the ability to cry. It's like, how can somebody kick a football further than other people? Yes, you can practice it, but really it's an ability that you have naturally that you can enhance. So I love how you said he does that actory thing. So I don't know. I don't know necessarily if that answers any of your questions. I just think it's literally a feeling. And I actually talked about this last week also. Thank you for indulging me for 20 minutes, by the way, again. And thank you for anybody who listened, because I did indulge myself for 20 minutes about it. But I started to try to figure out how to do it, and it left me. It went away because I was worried about it happening versus just allowing it to happen. And a lot of this stuff sounds metaphysical and it sounds unattainable, but it's just something that I think you can craft your intention. I think you can enlighten somebody. I think you can inspire somebody. I think you can manipulate somebody. I think you can blame somebody. All those verbs that we've talked about in the past. I think you can craft that intention, but I don't think you can craft emotions. And if it's not there on the page and you're not open to what's on the page, then it's going to fall flat. So if I was going to give an acting class advice, I would say, if it's happening, let it go. If it doesn't happen and you start worrying about it, that's going to be detrimental to anything that you do. So you're just going, I would say, find a strong verb and play the verb, because you can't to cry. You can't to emote. You can't to feel. You can't. You feel, you emote, you cry. They're not action words.
They're outcomes as opposed to, yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, correct. So I would say, what do you want to do to the other person? Well, I want to cry to manipulate. No. You want to manipulate them so they give you something. So they give you something back. And I would venture to say, if somebody's instinctually intact when it comes to the acting world, because once again, just like God, I'm twofold on this subject. I believe you're born to be an actor, but I also believe you can acquire the craft. But maybe you're born to acquire the craft. You know what I mean? Like, I just think some people, like Denzel Washington, is a born actor. You know, he was born to do what he does. You know, Tom Hanks, I think, acquired the craft. But man, did he acquire that craft. But maybe he was born to acquire it. Who knows? So I would say play the verb, and what happens, happens. And actually, I've had people tell me, well, you still have to find that emotional center and still play that emotional center because that's what you have in the scene to play. So you have to figure out, you know, basically a fake it to make it type of situation. I have a tendency to disagree with that. I think if you're not feeling it and you force it, that's worse to the audience than if you just straightforward barrel your way through it. Because I've been in both situations. I have felt it, let it go, and it's just been beautiful. And then I have come to the point where I was like, nope, nothing's happening. So I just barreled through it with a different intention. And then I kind of like did that thing where I was like faking it to try to get it back. And that to me felt worse. And I thought, even if somebody does have an emotional moment based on what I just did, it's fake. So I would rather barrel through it straightforward and not worry about the crying and not worry about the emotional part of it, because that would be real. And that's why they tell you moment to moment work is harder on stage than it is on film, because you've got this one time to do it on stage versus how many times to do it. But can you imagine trying to do it like 32 times? Like Kubrick? Kubrick wants you to cry 32 times. Oh my God.
But there's like opposites. But like you said, you had to go from a really emotional scene as one character, and you had 2 minutes to turn around as a different character and not show any of that emotion. I mean, that's something that an actor in a movie is not going to be expected to do. Very rarely do they even have like single scenes, kind of like what I felt like this one was with Brad Pitt, where he's actually starting in one place and ending in the other, like pretty much in real time, where, because you can just chop and cut and put this over here and move that over there and make, I mean, a director and an editor can make a scene out of pieces that is impossible on stage. So
let me clarify one thing. It was the same character just 2 minutes later, just a different emotional center. Okay. But I realized after talking about that last week, it was definitely difficult to do once I was in it, to come out of it. But that was me being selfish, me being so elated and so lit up by the fact that I actually got to go there, that I didn't want to let it go in 2 minutes, that I wanted to live in it for more than just 2 minutes. But that was not something that I could do. And like I said last week, if I was going on stage 2 minutes later and the tears were still coming, then I just readjusted where they were coming from based on the scene that I was going into. So it wouldn't look like I hadn't recovered from the scene before.
You just used it.
Yeah. That that happened, but not. And I look back on it and I say, yeah, that's just me being selfish because the moment was so freaking beautiful, man. It was so beautiful that once I came off stage, I was like, I don't really want to not live in this. And see, that's what I'm talking about. Right now, I could actually start thinking about it and start going there
Mm.
because I just think that's what's in me, and maybe that's something by doing this as a hobby slash craft slash fun that I'm exercising something inside me or allowing something that's always been inside me to come out, or maybe something was instilled in me that got me all messed up in the head and this is my therapy. I don't know. It could be a combination. It's probably a combination of all of the above, to be honest with you. Anyway, so let's wrap up this discussion about this movie.
Well, I think, I mean, that we kind of talked about all the things I wanted to talk about. And I think Brad Pitt did an amazing performance, like I said before. And I think technically this movie is very well done. Really don't have, I mean, the only other nitpick I have is like nobody's ever exploded a nuclear weapon in space. So I'm not really sure you can like ride the nuclear wave and get your boosters from nuclear explosions. But
Well, I'm glad you brought that up.
So whatever.
Right. But didn't you feel like in the first 3/4 of this film, you weren't saying this is just a movie? You were saying
right.
This makes sense for this world,
Yep.
what they chose to do. And it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. It's so logical with the choices they made. And they say near future, which I always hate near future because it's always somebody's weird interpretation of what things are going to be like. And they always get it wrong, except for Star Trek. They got it right quite a bit. Anyway, but I'm also a fan. So, but they got quite a few things not right. People were influenced by it and developed things. Anyway, so for the first 75% of this film, you're thinking, okay, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. And then you get this thing where he takes the door handle and rides through the rings of Neptune, and you're like, if there was anything in the first 75% of this film that was like that, like if he had to flip out of the lunar
Rover.
What is it called? The go-kart rover. I said go-kart. Lunar go-kart.
That's worse.
And then flip over and yeah, totally worse. That's why I'm making fun of myself because I would get such crap from some of my friends. But they would chalk it up to ignorance, not cleverness. But anyway, so if he flipped out and then flipped back in or something unexpected for the logic of this world happened, and maybe you're supposed to start to believe those things when he swims underwater and then comes up right before the thing takes off and he gets in there right at the nick of time and nothing blows up even though the doors open. Maybe that's where you're supposed to start to suspend your disbelief for these moments. But the end of the film is showered in those things. It's like they're showered into it. It was visually interesting to see a human being going through all those pebbles and everything in the rings of Neptune. But it just seemed like it just didn't ring true that could actually happen. I don't know.
It did. You're right. The end seemed a little hokey. It seemed a little kind of like put together last minute type of thing. But either way, I mean, I agree with you. I didn't like the end as much. But I mean, if I do watch this again, I'll probably focus a lot more on a lot of the technical stuff and the set pieces and stuff because I think they're really really well done. And I think that all of the kind of like floating was like wire work. So there wasn't like vomit comet type stuff. He didn't like get in a plane and go up and down in a plane like they did on Apollo 13 and all that stuff. But it still looked really good. I mean, it looked very natural. The scene, especially the moon buggy, this is the last thing like the coolest part I think of the moon buggy scene or the lunar rover scene was when they get kind of like thrown off into that crater where we're constantly hearing the buggy, the kind of wheels of the buggy, and they gets thrown off into that crater and it is absolutely silent the whole time they're in the air. And then they're also transitioning into the dark side of the moon. And it's really, I mean, like there's just so much tension. It is insane. And you kind of like see that this is the way that they get out, the way that they get away, but still at the same time, you're not really sure exactly how it's going to end up and there's nothing they can do. They're just kind of stuck spiraling, in this buggy, before it like hits the ground. I don't know. It was really cool. I really like that whole kind of scene in the middle. And that is like, it seems like that's like the pinnacle of the film. in a lot of ways, because there's still a lot of promise. We still don't know as much, and it is a crazy huge action piece compared to all the other stuff that goes on. The beginning of the movie kind of, but too, but it's a lot shorter, and we don't really know anything about him at that time, so it means less.
I think you're right. There is so much good here. The performances are outstanding, especially Brad Pitt, as you've mentioned, and as I've mentioned. And you're right. It looks beautiful. It sounds beautiful. The cinematography is beautiful. There's a lot of great things here. I don't mean to say that my questions are meant to be critical, but there are things that I was posing questions at the end of this film that didn't seem to have logical answers, but that did not detract from the fact that I think this is a movie worth seeing in the theater, and it's worth seeing, and I think it's well done. It's extremely well done. You know, I just always have questions, and sometimes those questions might just be my take on it. And I've said this before, you know, when I go to watch the film again and I start listening through what you were talking about, you were saying, you know, that you were saying about God and religion, I'll hear it from that point of view the next time I watch it. So a lot of times I will watch a film and then watch it again and think, oh, well, maybe I was focused on the wrong thing at that point. This is what I should have been focused on. And it's not necessarily the filmmaker's issue as it is me pondering something and losing or being distracted to something else. It's definitely an exceptional film, comparatively speaking, and it's definitely worth seeing.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. Okay. All right. You can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You can go to facebook.com/actorandengineer, and you can tweet us at actorengineer. We'll see you next time.